Welcome AP Economics students. This is Ms. Foley, and today we are going to be taking a look at factor markets as part of the College Board Microeconomics exam. So on this slide, I have some graphs to show you, and really what I want to focus on is a lot of the terminology and the key confusing concepts, because this section is really dominated by the concepts and applying them correctly instead of the graphs as much. So the big thing that you need to see on the top right-hand part of your screen, factor markets have been called inputs or resources on the exam, and sometimes they just call them factors. So any one of those things, factors, inputs, resources, we are talking about the producer's perspective when they want to make the decision how much of a factor, of an input, of a resource. Remember, we could be talking about land, we could be talking about capital, we could be talking about labor. How much of that should we have? Okay, so that's a big confusing concept because it's not something that comes natural to most of us. If you take a look at the key and the confusing concepts, so in that first box, that's what I described. In the second box, and excuse my allergies, looking at the total product and product price, you might be expected to calculate the marginal product. So make sure that you're very careful with marginal product and marginal revenue product on the exam. This is where people always get screwed up, and I'll show you about it in the free response question in just a few moments. But sometimes they'll give you a table, and it would say 0 units, 10 units, 20 units, 35 units, 38 units. And you need to figure out, first of all, what is the marginal product? So what is each worker, how many units do they bring? But when we compare if we should hire that worker or not, we are taking the units, the marginal product, and multiplying it by the product price. And that's where we get marginal revenue product. And that is what we use to compare, hey, do we hire this worker? We're going to look at the marginal revenue product, compare it to the wage rate of the worker, and it's very much like MR equals MC. It's that same concept that dominates microeconomics that goes over and over again. Okay, so what would shift the factor demand curve? So if you're talking about the demand for labor, if you're talking about the demand for land, if you're talking about the demand for capital, what are some things that would do that? Changes in the prices of goods. So if the goods become more valuable, then the wage rate that we are willing to hire a worker, when we compare it to the new total revenue, that might be higher. That marginal revenue product might be higher. So that could definitely change. Changes in the supply of other factors, if other factors make things more accessible. Obviously, change in technology, if it makes it more efficient, more productive, those are things. Another concept that you need to know, economic rent is similar to producer surplus. That's a good way to explain it. The idea here is that economic rent applies to factor markets and producer surplus applies in the markets for goods and services. So that's where we separate the two. One goes in the factor market area, that's economic rent. One goes in the product market, that is consumer surplus. We want to hire at the intersection of the wage and the MRP, or in the rental rate and the MRP. So that's the same concept right here in the middle. This is that MR equals MC, kind of twin brother concept that dominates microeconomics. Make sure you know that. You might be asked to utilize the cost minimization rule, and all that is putting these these two things together. What is the marginal product? So that's the actual unit, how many units of labor over the wage rate. And we want to set that equal to the marginal product of capital. Many times we use the word K for capital, that way to differentiate them. Over the rental rate, and we're going to keep employing factors so that the dollar spent on each factor is the same. That is not profit maximization, it is cost minimization. Make sure you understand the differences between those two terms. Looking at the last row of confusing topics, be prepared to identify and explain sources of income inequality for the AP exam. I don't know exactly where they're going to go with this, but they might ask you kind of like a random little free response question. Why are people paid differently? If you go back through our unit slides, there's lots of different reasons. Obviously, the big one that stands out, one person might be more talented than the other. You pay Tom Brady more than you pay Jameis Winston. So they both played quarterback for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but one is way more talented. So that could be a situation. Another situation could be maybe you are a cashier at a grocery store, but the person that works the night shift, which maybe isn't the, greatest and, hours, that they're going to get paid more than the person who works the day shift because that schedule is a little bit easier. If you're talking about something like teaching, teachers that are more experienced, that have been there longer, and teachers that are more educated. So if you go into teaching and you get your advanced degree, that could possibly be a reason why you are getting paid more. So that is those are things that if they ask for income inequality, that's what they're talking about. Then, of course, you could talk about the illegal income inequality. I mean, it's illegal, but I know it still exists. That depending on sometimes gender or ethnic background, that might be a reason why people get paid unequally. So they might ask you that in kind of like a big picture question, and those are the things that you can go into. A really good way to define unions. Unions are like single sellers of labor. They essentially, through a concept called collective bargaining, they will, make decisions and bargain for the good of a group. So there's lots of different unions. The NFL players have a union called the NFLPA, and what they do is, how much time you're allowed to practice, how many games they're allowed to play, those kinds of workplace issues. In teaching, teachers are part of a union. Again, how many hours teachers work, how many classes they teach, how much they get paid if they've worked for this many years, if they get this amount of education. So when you have a situation like a union, that is what sets up a monopsony. And that is shown over here with this graph, and that shows how you would get that equilibrium price, okay? Which is different than, this is a perfectly competitive labor market, and as you can see in a perfectly competitive labor market, it's just a regular supply and demand curve, and that gives you your supply curve, which in perfect competition of labor is a horizontal line. Okay, and then the demand for labor, the MRP, both in perfect competition and in the monopsony, they are both a downward sloping demand curve. So the difference between whether you have a monopoly of labor or perfectly competitive labor is what that supply curve looks like. And you might be asked to just explain what each graph would look like. And again, employers will hire a factor of production up to the point where MFC is equal to MRP. We know this. That's why if you look at the graph, if you look at the firm over here in perfect competition, that equilibrium is where you are taking a look at it. And if you're taking a look over here, that would be the competitive equilibrium. But this, as you can see in a monopsony, is where they're actually going to get paid. And that is because there is a monopoly on that particular form of labor. The last concept that I'm going to tell you about is derived demand. Very important concept from this unit. It's on the bottom left-hand part of your screen. When you're talking about factor markets, you need to adequately be able to explain that what derived demand is. So, for example, if you take a look at the first graph is the supply and the demand for ice cream. Because people love ice cream, the derived demand is ice cream machine market. So because people like ice cream, in order to get ice cream, you need to have ice cream machines. And that is an example of derived demand. So make sure that you understand what derived demand is. I think the popular example that they use in the Krugman textbook, if for example, if you are in a town and all of a sudden they build like senior citizen housing, the derived demand will go up for nurses in that town. Why? Because when a bunch of senior citizens move into a town, more likely than not, they're going to demand health care. They're going to need, they're older in age. There's some, other things that could go wrong. So they're going to demand health care. And therefore, the derived demand is nurses. So more seniors move into a town, derived demand equals more nurses are needed in that town. So make sure that you really are thorough when you think about examples like that. Okay, here is a sample free response question. I can definitely see a question like this if you're talking about the online learning college board exam. So we have our number of workers, and notice it's very important what they give you. They give you marginal revenue product per day. Okay, it is a perfectly competitive firm, so we know that no matter what, we're going to get that perfect competition with labor. And we know that the product price is also not changing. That product price is going to be $5. So question A is calculate the marginal. Notice how they're trying to help you. Physical product of the third worker. Okay. If we take a look at the third worker brings in $450 per day. If we take this number, because this is the total marginal revenue product, and we divide it by the market price, then we will be able to know how much physical product the third worker brought in. So for letter A, $450 divided by 5 equals 90 units. That would be the answer to letter A. Okay, letter B. What is the law of diminishing returns? Law of diminishing marginal returns, and why does it occur? The law of diminishing marginal returns. This occurs now. In class, I would always use the example. Think of like a pizzeria. You own a pizzeria. Let's say I'm thinking about hanging out in a like an M&S2. M&S2 is a nice sized pizzeria. I think they have like four pizza ovens in the front if you take a look at it. And those are fixed things that they bought. They have the land there, they have the store built, they have the ovens. Now, if you are saying as the owner of M&S, how many workers should I hire? you need to consider the law of diminishing marginal returns. And what happens is you're going to start hiring workers. And originally, your marginal revenue product is going to go up. Your marginal product is going to go up. But then it's going to hit a point where the marginal product and therefore the marginal revenue product both start to go down. And it's not that you hired bad workers, it's that there's just only 4 ovens. There's only a certain amount of space in that restaurant. If I hired 40 workers at that M&S2, there's not enough room for 40 people to be in there, okay? I think that their perfect equilibrium is probably 6 workers. You got like 4 workers working in the back, 2 working in the front, maybe 1 person rotating off of the cashier. So if you add more people, they get in the way, they ruin productivity, and that's the definition of law of diminishing marginal returns. So this is how I wrote it for the exam. The law of diminishing returns, as more and more units of a variable input, in my example, the variable input is labor, are added to a fixed input, like there's only a set amount of ovens, there's only a set amount of store space, the output increases at a decreasing rate. Diminishing returns occurs because of the overuse of the fixed input. Okay, so that's the definition. Sometimes on the AP exam, they like to ask you that. Diminishing marginal returns occur with the hiring of which worker? So if we look at this firm, worker number 1 brings in $450. Worker number 2 brings in $500. Good. So that goes up. Lovely. Worker number 3, whoa, we go down to $450 again. That is a decreasing rate. We added a worker, they provided less. The answer to letter C, diminishing marginal returns, we first start to see it when we hire the 3rd worker. Okay? Letter D, what is the highest daily wage rate that the firm is willing to pay to hire the 5th worker? So if you're looking at this chart, this is what each worker brings. As long as this number is higher than the wage rate, then you're good. Okay, so if I go down to the question says the 5th worker, the 5th worker is bringing in $300 per day. That means the highest that I would be willing to pay for this individual is $300. They bring in $300 and I'd be willing to pay them $300. That is it. That's the highest. And if the wage rate was $300, I'd hire this worker, I'd hire this worker, I'd hire this worker, I'd hire this worker, because all of these numbers are greater than $300. I hire this worker because it's just like that MR equals MC. When they're equal to each other, we say, okay. I don't hire this worker because they're only bringing in $100 and I'd have to pay them $300. So if they're asking what is the highest daily wage rate for the 5th worker, it would be $300. Last but certainly not least, what will happen to the demand for labor if the market price of the product increases? So right now, the market price is $5. Let's say that goes up to like $7 or $10. What is going to happen to labor? Well, we're going to increase our demand for labor because now we're going to have all these numbers are now going to be higher, okay? If we go from 5 to 10, that means that this is 900. That means that this is 1,000. That means that this is 900. That means that this is 800 because I doubled the market price, so I'm doubling the marginal revenue product, okay? That's what that means there. And then when you apply that to the existing wage rate, obviously you're then going to hire more workers because the marginal revenue product has stayed the same. the marginal revenue product has gone up, but the wage rate has stayed the same. Okay, so this is just kind of a little bit of a review, a little introduction to factor markets. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to me. I really miss talking to you, and I'm not really a fan of staring at a screen. So hope you're well. Talk to you soon. Bye.